careful not to sit on something that's a prop up here. I don't know if this is real or not, but anyway. I want to tell you a little story about Robert Letourneau. A lot of you might know him because of Letourneau University. In fact, I believe we have some Letourneau University grads here in our congregation. There we go. There's Matt Knighton. Skylar's not here, but I'm sure he would be equally excited. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur and a philanthropist. He became a believer in his early teenage years at a Plymouth Brethren church. He saw himself as being partnered with God in his business. And in the early stages of his life, he prided himself on his ability to create and invent. He made dirt moving equipment. In fact, probably most of what you see working on road crews today in some capacity or another would trace its roots back to him and his inventions. But he was soon convicted that he was doing too much for his own kingdom and not enough for God's kingdom. He started this kind of journey as it applied to him in a personal way financially and even in a business sense by tithing 10% of what he made. And that might seem fairly normal to us, but he was doing this with his company's funds as well. And there were many times where he would make a pledge to give to missions. And this was at a time when he was barely able to make payroll. And God would come through again and again and again for him. And over the course of his life, he slowly shifted that percentage of what he was giving versus what he was living on from giving away 10 and living on 90 to, by the end of his life, giving away 90 and living on 10% of his income. Letourneau is quoted as saying, "It's not how much of my money I give to God, but how much of God's money I keep for myself." At the end of his life, he held more than 300 patents, and his machines that he had designed and invented and built, they represented about 70% of the earth-moving equipment that was used in World War II. So all of the airfields, roads, everything that was being built in Europe, a lot of that was by his machinery. His equipment were involved in building the Hoover Dam, the interstate system here in the United States, a largely influential man. Yes, he did also build a university in his namesake, and as well as Christian camps and conference centers. But he said, "You'll never know what you can accomplish until you say a great big yes to the Lord." If the tone of the service today hasn't kind of primed your mind to know, or you haven't read ahead in Corinthians to know that we're going to be in chapter 9, and Paul is talking about surrendering his rights. Letourneau is a great example of someone who just yielded more and more and more of himself to God. Now, you could look at this sort of cynically and say, well, sure, when you make that much money, living off of 10%, what's the big deal? But honestly, how many people do we know in today's world that make that much money and are living off of 10% of what they make? Not many. God had done something in his heart. So Paul's been talking to the church about their rights. This has gone chapter by chapter by chapter, and it's involved different topics of conversation. There was a large conversation on sexuality and how that was playing out, but the root of that was, how much of your rights are you claiming and are you living out right now? They were living with an extreme kind of freedom, and their freedoms and their rights were coming before anything else. And Paul now takes this chapter to put his own life out there for observation and for criticism. And I would say he's giving it as a way that we should be following him. And he takes the same kind of approach of, are you free? Yes. And then there's a but. But we should be doing something differently with our freedom. Also, the tone of this chapter shifts. Paul kind of lets his hair down, and he's obviously hurting. He asks them 17 questions. It's almost like a speed bag, a boxer hitting a speed bag. And so the sermon is fairly simple today. It kind of breaks into two parts. The first part being, I have rights, and the second part being, but I lay them down. That's Paul's essential message. So I want to start reading the first couple of verses. He says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." He starts by talking about his rights, and he's going to build a big, long case on, I really have my rights. They are mine. I have them. I can use them. And so the first of these is positional. I have positional rights based on who I am. And these are the questions. If any of these are answered in the negative, then his whole case falls apart. Am I not free? Yes, Paul, you're free. Am I an apostle? Yes, you're an apostle. Have I not seen Jesus? Yes. Are you not my workmanship? Yes. All of these are answered in the affirmative. And so Paul is saying, look, positionally, I'm this person that has a certain kind of rights. He's a free person. He's an apostle. He's an eyewitness. He's their spiritual father. He's saying positionally, I have these rights. But then he moves into some logical examples, things that just, according to kind of human wisdom, we would all just grasp as being also yes answers. This is verse 3. He goes, this is my defense to those of you who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? And so now he's moved from positionally, I have these rights, to now, just logically speaking, aren't these just basic human rights? Do I have the right to food, to eat and drink? Now, I think he's talking about his daily sustenance, of course. But also, he's just coming off the chapter on food sacrificed to idols and the fact that if your faith is secure and you know an idol is just a thing that's man-made, then the meat is just made by God. Enjoy. So he's saying, look, I have these rights. Do I have the right to have a wife and essentially take her with me and her be part of the mission? He says, yes, obviously. Do I have the right to refrain from secular work? So remember, when Paul came to Corinth, he was working as a tent maker with several other people, and they were essentially bivocational. They had their day job, and then they had their ministry. And he said, I have a right not to do that. We'll talk about his reason why he might not take that right. But then he gives us 3 examples: soldier, gardener, and shepherd. Does a soldier fight at his own expense? No. Does a gardener garden and not take the fruit? No. Does a shepherd not use the sheep? No. And he's referencing kind of a common arrangement that people would make. If you were a landowner, you had a vineyard, or you had a flock of sheep, you would essentially hire someone, typically who's poor, who would kind of live out there on site. You can drive through this part of the world and see this happening still today. A large vineyard, and you'll see these little tiny huts kind of out throughout the vineyard, and it's a family living inside of there. Their job is tend the fields. Part of their payment, though, is they get to take some of this for themselves to sell for their own, to cover their own expenses and for their own life. And so Paul is using all very basic common examples to say, look, logically speaking, do I have rights? And the answer again is, yes, Paul, you have rights. But you're sensing with the speed and the repetition of these questions, there's some kind of pain here for Paul. Now he shifts into theological rights. Verse 8, he says, do I say these things on human authority? Does the law not say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads the grain. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow with hope, and the thresher should thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? And so he opens this and he says, look, so positionally, I'm all of these things to you. Logically, we all can agree that we should be able to eat and drink. And now he's going, but theologically, God has said something to us. He gives this example where, well, first off, he says, I'm not doing these things by my own authority. He's claiming God's authority, and he goes back to the law. There's an Old Testament law which says you shall not muzzle the ox. And so if you think of an ox attached to a big arm with a grinding wheel, they'll bring in the wheat and the grain, and they'll put it on top of the grinding wheel. It will go in, and the ox just walks in a circle all day long, doing what would, for us as humans, be excruciating, backbreaking work of turning a mill. And the command in Scripture was, don't muzzle the ox. So you imagine you have an ox where there's grain. What's he going to do as he's walking all day? He's going to pick some up and he's going to eat it. The Old Testament command was, don't cover his mouth so that he can't eat. And now Paul is saying, do you think it's for the ox that I say this to you? Paul says, no, it was for the sake of the plowman. It was for the sake of the thresher. It's for your sake that I'm saying this. Don't muzzle the ox. The reason why is he wants there to be hope. It is good for us, and it is good for our hope. Verse 11, if we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much that we reap material things from you? So Paul has built this case of, I have rights for all of these reasons, answer all of these seemingly rhetorical questions, and we would all say, okay, Paul, yes, you have rights. So I want to pause for a moment. If you have the handout, there's a question, a personal inventory, and this is under your rights. And I just want to pause and let you reflect on this. What are things that you really have? I mean, actually have. Paul's not just building a straw man case here. Paul is saying, look, I actually have these things. There's rights you actually have. As Americans, we're very fond of our rights. Right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We talk about these things being self-evident. It's a great philosophical claim. Self-evident rights. So take a moment, write down what are some of those rights. Do you have a right to your money? Do you have a right to your time? Do you have a right to your body? Do you have a right to your plan for your life? Do you have a right to your family? These are all different rights that we claim, that we would say are God-given even. It's okay to have rights. It's the question of what do we do with our rights? The second half of this chapter, Paul shifts, and he's talking about relinquishing his rights. Beginning in the second half of verse 12, he says, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple get their food from the temple? And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But if I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Paul has all of these rights, and he's built the case of, yes, everything I deserve. When we get angry at God in our life, have you ever been there in your life, where you get mad that something's not going the way you think it should? It's because we're taking a right and we're saying, God, I deserve this and it's mine, and you're allowing it to be taken from me, or you're taking it from me. Paul has all of these reasons that he could claim for himself. In fact, he adds a few more. He relates this to temple service. Even in the secular temples there in Corinth, the people who worked the temple would receive payment from the temple. And Paul's saying, all of these things I'm setting aside. Verses 12 and 15, he says, I'm not making any of this. In fact, verse 15, he leads off in a new dramatic tone. He says, I would rather die. A little dramatic, Paul. I'd rather die than let anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. Which makes you ask the question, what on earth is his ground of boasting, right? What is he so excited about boasting about that he would rather die than lose this ground? I think his ground for boasting is twofold. Number one, we see that he has a calling and commission from God. So if he takes their money, if he takes payment for what he is doing, then there would be this big question mark of, well, are you just doing this for the pay? And Paul is saying, well, if I do it for the pay, my ground of boasting that God has called me here to do this is stripped from me. His work didn't come from his need for money. His work in the gospel didn't come from his need for money, but it came from a call that God laid on his life. And the second side of this boasting is the fact that he could freely serve people. The gifts he received were not a salary to him. This was the body of Christ from other places. The church in Thessalonica, the church in Macedonia, the church around were sending money to Paul so that he could continue his work as he went from place to place. So why would he not want to take their money then? If Paul obviously needs money to live, and if he's trying to make the gospel free, and a free gospel is his ground for boasting, why not take money from the Corinthians? Well, could be any number of reasons. I think part of it is he's wanting to keep his stewardship or his calling pure and without entanglements. The way of the world in Corinth, and in many ways our world, is the people who have the money tend to make the rules. In Corinth, they would use their money to create alliances and to create dependencies, much like foreign aid. Right? We give a country and a government lots of money, and then at some point, someone in our government taps someone on their shoulder and go, hey, psst, you know that money? That wasn't really free money. We want you to do something on our behalf with that money. Right? And Paul is aware that if he takes money from any one of the patrons, remember the opening chapter, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. He realizes there's these factions, and if he takes money from one, he's choosing a side. And so the fact that it's outside support funding him allows him to speak and to minister freely in this country. 1 Corinthians was definitely a sad letter where Paul, again and again, you can just kind of get this sad tone from him. Philippians, ironically, is one of Paul's happy letters. I say it's ironic that it's one of his happy letters because he's actually in prison when he's writing this letter, and he talks about his joy being made full. I want to read a couple of verses from you. So we know from Paul's life that he went through all kinds of things. He had great moments of joy and triumph. And then he also had moments of defeat, moments where he was beaten, moments where he was shipwrecked. We know ultimately he was martyred for the sake of the gospel. There's a verse, I'm going to read it in context because we pull it out of context to mean all kinds of things, right? The verse is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we use this kind of like a self-actualizing, live the American dream, I can achieve everything, be who you want to be kind of way. And we quote that verse of, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You know, sort of like a Nike slogan or something like that. It's the Christian Nike slogan. And that's not at all what Paul is saying. Paul's actually saying quite the reverse. Listen to it in context. This is Philippians 4, starting verse 10. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have received your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Now that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. So he's playing these two sides. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He's saying, look, God has allowed me to suffer great lack. He's writing from prison where he's saying, I can do all things. So Paul writing this chapter here, again, this is early in his ministry. You could go, yeah, I mean, you'll calm down by the time your ministry's towards the end. No, he didn't. Paul just got worse and worse and worse with this, right? Where he wound up in prison, he's saying, my joy is complete. Make my joy complete. I can do all things through Christ. I can abound, and I can have wealth, and I can suffer lack, and I can be needy and can be imprisoned. For us, a lot of times, our ability to serve God is all of our needs have to be met, and then we have the space to serve God. Mess with any one of those needs, and all of a sudden, that becomes our one singular focus. Meet that need. I want to pause again, and I want you to take a personal inventory. And the prompt question is, how can I give up my rights for the sake of the gospel? If you don't have a bulletin to write stuff down, maybe pull out your phone and just take a quick note. What are my rights, and how can I give these rights up? You really do have them. Paul, do you have rights? Yes, absolutely. And Paul says, I lay my rights down. As I was mulling over this week, a few words came to mind. One word was forgiveness. When we forgive, we're yielding our right to retribution. Right? When we don't forgive, I want to see the other person pay, right? It's a demonstration of the gospel. Jesus says they'll know you're Christians by your love. And so when I forgive, I'm yielding that right that I have to see justice enacted, to say, I'm letting it go. Thought of another word, generosity. This is yielding my right to my resources. This is a demonstration of faith in God's provision. The early church in Acts, one of the beautiful things about it says they had all things in common. The people who had more took that more that they had, and they sold it, and they gave it and shared it with those who had less, so that none of them had any need amongst the brethren. Another word is flexibility. This doesn't just mean, you can go with the flow or whatever. We're talking about yielding our right to have our own plan, being flexible and open to what is God's plan in our life. Think through the story of Esther and how she was in a precarious situation. And at one point she was told, you were here for such a time as this. Her plan was not to be the queen to this very despotic ruler. Her plan was to probably lead her quiet life way off the radar. God changed her plans. The Bible is filled with stories of people whose plans were changed, who were going one way, who had one right over their life and said, okay, God, I will yield this for you. I think of the next word, community, yielding the right to my space and my wants. This is a demonstration of love for God's people. It takes work and time and energy to experience community as Christians together. So what's at stake, though? We talk about giving up our rights, and it's easy to gloss over this passage. It's easy to see Paul using himself as an example and say, well, Paul's an apostle and we're not. Who does this really apply to? Does it apply to us? What if we don't do it? And Paul is applying this to the local church there because he's just talked with them about yielding their rights, and now he's talking about his own life of, here's how this looks in my life. Which is why we need to take pause, each of us, and go, what are my rights, and how am I yielding them, or how can I yield them for the sake of the gospel? But there's something at stake either way if we do or we don't. When the Corinthians did not relinquish their rights, the name of Christ was harmed. There's the man who's with his father's wife, right? Paul is saying, look, even the people in secular Corinthian culture aren't doing this thing. And no one's calling him out over it. Well, it's his right. And Paul's saying, no. I mean, yes, but no, it's not. There's the issue of food sacrificed to idol in the temples and eating this food. And they don't want to give up their rights, and their brothers and sisters are being destroyed. They're turning back to their idolatry because they just want their freedom and their rights. So there was a huge payoff when they would not relinquish their rights, and now we see Paul relinquishing his rights. What's the payoff? What's the whole end game here, Paul? His whole end game is that the gospel becomes free. Verse 18, what then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. I have a right. I have a right to be paid for what I'm doing, and I'm choosing to work as a tent maker and to take money from churches and Christians and other places to fund what I'm doing so that in the ministry here, my work has become free. So we see what happened when the Corinthians didn't relinquish their rights. We see when Paul relinquishes his rights, the gospel becomes free and begins moving throughout the ancient world. But what about us? What if we relinquish our rights? What if the church in America relinquished their rights? But what if we don't? This isn't something that we can choose to do or not do. It's an easy chapter to miss and to gloss over. I met a group of people that were working with some Saudi students on a college campus. And the longer they did this, they got connected to some refugees that were living there. And they were a little bit hurt by this group that they were serving because this group didn't appreciate them, right? We have a right to be appreciated. And this group doesn't appreciate me. And so they were saying, look, this group is telling us God sent you here to serve us, right? So there's this air of pride. There's this air of pride. God sent you here to serve us. And in response to this, one of them finally figured out, you know what, instead of us being, our own pride being hurt by this, like that's obviously coming from a point of pride in them. We shouldn't expect them to have the humility of Christ. If they don't know Jesus, how can they live like Jesus? And so instead of getting hurt that they're not appreciating what we're doing, that they don't respect us, that they don't whatever, we're going to lay our rights down. There's a little subtle clue in what they said that helps unlock all of this. God sent you here to serve us. What if we go, yes, you're right. God did send me here to serve you. That's exactly what this is. Wow, you've figured out why we're together. God sent me here to serve you. God sent me here with a message to share for you. See, when we change the tone of that, all of a sudden we go, wow, if I relinquish that right to be appreciated, that need to be appreciated, and I just say, you know what? Jesus says that we should become servants of all. And so it's okay to say, in the footsteps of Jesus, I'm serving you. I relinquish that right to my pride, to my need to be respected, to be appreciated, to have my position recognized, my education recognized. I just go, you know what? You're right. God sent me here to serve you. It completely changed the tone of their ministry when they started thinking like this. I want to apply this in a couple of different ways. One is very obvious. Rights relinquished yield rewards. Relinquish your rights. Take those two lists that you thought about or that you wrote down and look at them and just pray through that with God, going, what do I have that I can give up for your sake so that the world would look different? When we give to God freely, no one can say it's because we're paid to serve him. And God rewards us for our heart of service. One of the hardest changes, this is just on a personal level for me, one of the hardest changes about becoming a pastor is whoever I was as a Christian is now discounted because, quote, it's my job, right? If I'm friendly to people or invite someone over, which is how I've always been, now people go, oh, you're just doing that because you're the pastor. You're just talking to me because you're the, right? There's that sense. But when we realize what is something free in my life that I can just give to God, no one can say anything. There's no question mark that can be drawn around that. We're called to yield our rights. We can follow in the footsteps of Paul. We can follow in the footsteps of Jesus here. But this isn't a human trait. Human trait is we fight and we die to protect our rights. We build walls to protect our rights. We build defense systems to protect our rights. And so again and again, as we go through this book, I've tried to stay gospel-focused. And what I mean by that, when we think of the gospel, we think, well, that's the message of Jesus dying and rising again for our salvation. And that's the beginning of the gospel, but the continuation of the gospel is the life we now live, we live by his power day by day. And Corinthians, more than any book of the Bible, I think, we take it and we make it formulaic. We turn it into a list of do's and don'ts. We turn it into a system of things that we can accomplish in our own strength. If you have a spirituality that you can accomplish in your own strength, you have a man-made spirituality. And so in the application, you keep hearing me say again and again, but this is something we can't do. When we read the scriptures, we should always go, God, what is the part of this that we can't do in our own strength? Because if we do it in our own strength, we get the glory, we have the power to do it, et cetera, et cetera. If it's only something that God can do in us, and so if we're able to do it, we go, wow, God is actually working in my life. That's where we need to focus. Relinquishing our rights is not one of those things we can just naturally do in our human flesh, because naturally our flesh is selfish. We want what we want, and we want to keep it and protect it. And so when we talk about relinquishing our rights, we go, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds easy. I'll do that. No, you won't. No, you can't. We need Jesus to transform us so that we can relinquish our rights. Number two, we need to find creative ways to make the gospel free. We need to Googleize the gospel. Google, one thing I love about them as a company is they take a really cool innovation and then they make it free. The darker side is they spy on you for the rest of your life for that free service, but we don't need to copy that part. But the idea that we have something that the world needs, that they shouldn't have to pay to receive. If you go on any of these temple site visits with me and you talk with the people who work there, you realize a lot of them are bivocational until their congregation hits a certain size. And that seems logical to us, but when you hear the explanation more and more, it's because everything that they do, they charge their congregation for. You have a loved one die, there's a fee that goes with that. You're getting married, there's a fee that goes with that. And so when the fees create a salary for someone to do the job of their ministry position, that is when they hire a full-time person. And that might sound similar to what we do here, but it's actually not. Think about our missionaries. We're giving freely to people who bring zero benefit directly to our congregation. We're sending them to places that have zero connection to our neighborhood. We're sending them around the world. We're trying to make the gospel free and accessible to everyone so that you don't have to have money to pay a temple tax, as it were, to be able to come in and meet with God. God is here for free for you. And he's called us to co-opt together but that involves us giving up some of our rights. Very simply, give to the church. Help the local community of faith. Reach the community. Help us raise up new workers here. Give to missions. Help missionaries make the gospel free around the world. But one area that we often think about is very easy to write a check and let someone else do the work. In fact, maybe that even gives us a sense of peace and release from having to engage ourselves in it. Use your time for the kingdom. Volunteer. We all have some amount of time. This is the great equalizer in the world. The rich, the poor, black, white, northern, southern, eastern, western. Doesn't matter where you're from, you all get the same amount of time in the day. Do you have lunch breaks free? Do you have an afternoon off? Do you have a weeknight that you can do something? Volunteer with that. There's somewhere, and I don't just mean volunteer at Mountain View. I mean, find a place. God's kingdom's big. I worked in the oil field several years back and had lunch break time. And I thought I'd just sit here every day and do nothing. I'd just come back from the field and was maybe a little bit bitter about that with God. Why am I here in Houston instead of overseas? And but He gave me a job where I could take a decent lunch break and nobody would ask any questions. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to write up a prayer guide. And every day I'd sit there on my lunch break and work on this prayer guide. It was 30 days of prayer for the Muslim world. It was 2 pages each day. The first page was kind of just a short devotional. Then the next page was I picked a country, just went by population from greatest to smallest. I started sending this out during Ramadan each year. Every year, I still do this. Every year, I have people email me, hey, in today's one on Turkey, you mentioned that there's Turkish people living and working here in the States. And it just dawned on me, I'm working right next to a Turkish person, next cubicle over. God impressed on me to reach this person with the gospel. See, this is not something I can do. Yes, the time that I gave, that was something I could do. That was a right that I could yield. It just took a little bit of dedication every single day to put something out that now we're able to see people mobilized and trained and encouraged and convicted that, hey, we're living and working with Muslims all around us. And God put us here to do something. And so, yes, give, but also think of your own time and space and your rights in that regard. How do we turn these over to God? Finally, we need to share in Paul's urgency to make the gospel free. We need to feel his sense of woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. And you might go, well, I'm not an apostle, I'm not a pastor, I'm not a missionary. I don't think that's what Paul is saying. I think Paul would say all of us are supposed to be sharing in this role of making the gospel known, of making Jesus known. There's 8 billion people on the planet, roughly. 40% of those people have never heard the gospel. Most of that 40% not only have not heard the gospel, because you say, well, my neighbors maybe never heard the gospel, or maybe coworkers never heard the gospel. But guess what? There's churches all over the area in their language. They could hear the gospel. So it's sad, but they have access. This 40%, they don't have access. That's the greater challenge, is that not only have they not heard the gospel, there's no conceivable, logical way for them to hear the gospel the way things currently are. This is why we pool money together and send missionaries around the world. This is why we work on translation projects. It's so that the gospel can be known amongst these 40%. But this requires all of the church yielding our rights together. Let me pray. God, yielding our rights is not something that we are naturally able to do or gifted to do or want to do even. It's not fun. And yet it's something that you call all of us to. We see in Corinth, and we can probably point to many examples in our own culture where when we claim our rights, bad things happen. This is almost the root of wars and conflicts and violence, is some claim on a right. But you yourself lead us in the example. You had every right, every claim. You were the creator of heaven and earth. You spoke the world into existence, and yet you left all of that. You put yourself in human form, the form of a servant who died on the cross. This is the life you invite us to. Empower us.